we not live already?
Well, on YouTube. We're live on StreamYard, and now we're
Mhm.
going live on YouTube.
Sounds great.
You're live.
I'm live.
I think we're delayed a little bit, so
That's
hi
fine.
everybody.
Hi.
How are you all today?
Hopefully alive.
Hopefully.
Yeah,
It's a good thing to do. Good thing to
that's
be.
us. Yeah. Refold streaming alive.
It'd be interesting to see it the other way around. A little morbid.
Streaming it
Probably not
dead.
allowed on YouTube, but
Probably not.
streaming
I've
from
been
the
noticing
afterlife.
like all sorts of things have been blurred out on YouTube now. Um, and I think people are doing it so they don't get canceled off YouTube or demonetized.
There's also there was some change a while ago where swearing in the first 30 seconds of a video can trigger the thing, and so there's like a lot of bleeping out in the first 30 seconds, and then after that it's all hats are off, all bets are off.
Everyone's gaming the system.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Well, it's kind of what you got to do, right? If you
I
want to
suppose.
actually make money on it.
Mm-hmm.
But anyways, how are you? How is
I'm actually doing
Ethan?
really good. I'm like, I've been, uh, I finally have my like real energy back. I feel like I've been like a pretty low energy person the past 6 months, and I'm like back into the swing of things. And part of that has led to just like talking to a lot of interesting people. And so I've been like networking and talking to a lot of folks. And
Mm-hmm.
so been meeting like researchers and cognitive psychologists, and then also people in the startup space doing other language learning things, investors who are interested in ed tech. So it's just been like a very exciting couple of weeks talking through all of that.
That's cool.
And I think I've said this to the folks internally, but like I have a very clear vision of like, here's where we're going, here's what we need to do and what we need to build. And now we just got to execute on it. So
That's great.
it's nice to have that clarity after like more than 3 years of trying to sort of figure it out, and figure out like what this is going to be long term.
Mm-hmm.
I think the 3 years were definitely worth doing because it really taught us an enormous amount about everything going on in language learning and like what we need to build and like what the challenges that learners face are so that we can actually like build the right thing. And now I'm like
Definitely.
ready to get running with actually building the stuff.
Yeah, I mean, all the experience that we've gathered over those years, I think, is just going to be so invaluable going forward.
Yeah.
Because like we can do these streams essentially off the cuff with
Mm-hmm.
a lot of good information, just because all of us have been, ironically, so immersed in immersion learning,
Yeah.
which is very helpful for that execution. Which is
Yeah. I've had a
exciting.
couple conversations with people where like they sit down and they're like, have you thought about this? I'm like, yes. And we've also written an article and recorded a video. And like, here's the terminology that we use.
Classic.
And like yesterday, I was talking to an entrepreneur, and he does like phonics learning with kids, and they're
Mm-hmm.
sort of like pivoting with a company. And he's like, we've been thinking a little bit about like accent reduction. Like, do you know anything about the area? I'm like, I sure do. Let's talk about it.
That's funny, but cool also because you're,
Yeah.
like you said, talking to so many people.
Mm-hmm.
Anything particularly intriguing or interesting that you came across in the past couple of weeks that you might want to share? Maybe not even necessarily language learning related, but that you have on your mind.
Yeah, I mean, I've been reading this book, Peak, which actually was recommended to me by JS Joe, in the server, so who we were just talking about. And it, I'm, it doesn't have great ratings as a book on
Uh-huh.
Amazon or Goodreads or whatever, but I'm finding it so applicable to what we're doing. Like every single chapter, I'm like, yes, I will take this and like use it in my mental model of how everything needs to work. Um, and it's the guy who coined the term deliberate practice, who that 10,000 hour rule that Malcolm Gladwell popularized was based on his research.
Interesting.
And he actually has a whole section about that, about how that's the wrong interpretation. So like, don't trust the 10,000 hour rule. But it's just been very interesting understanding sort of his perspective on what is deliberate practice and like the things that we think are a limitation on human potential are actually just a limitation on how you do the thing or how you practice the thing. And once you figure out the right way to practice, it massively improves the speed and the distance that you can go uh, quickly
Do you have an
in
example?
whatever discipline. So, um, one of the examples that he gives, and that has also been displayed in other places, is running.
Hmm.
So there used to be all of these things of like, oh, the human body can't go past X speed, or the human body like can't run a 4 minute mile. That was like an unbreakable rule. And then
Until it's broken.
yeah, and then somebody broke it, and then now everybody can do it. Not everybody, but
Yeah.
everybody who trains for it. And he talks about this one runner who um, set a world record in like 5 or 6 different running events, and just like blew everyone else out of the water for multiple years. And it was because he had a completely different way of training. And as soon as everyone else adopted that way of training, now everybody is that good. It wasn't a limitation on the human; it was a limitation on the practice. And
That
so
that
his
makes a lot of sense for things that I've seen as well.
yeah. And the funny thing is like the time that he would run like his marathon time, that was like the best in the world when he did it, that like nobody else could even come close to, now is like barely a qualifier for the Boston Marathon.
Wow.
Yeah.
Impressive. That makes me kind of a couple years ago, I used to follow like competitive Tetris, like NES Tetris.
Hmm.
And so I occasionally still get recommendations on like big things that happen. And all the time, there's just huge records broken and like things that are thought to be completely humanly impossible a couple years ago are now just like 15-year-old kids are doing it all the time.
Yep.
And there's like completely new records being set. And yeah, it's a lot about technique and practice. Um, and I've always sort of, I guess, wondered why those sorts of things are like they just seem so impossible to literally everybody. And then like a decade later, it's normal. Is
Yeah.
just it was always been interesting to me. So that does make actually a lot of sense.
Yeah. And I think one of the mental things that changed for me in reading the book is before with Refold, the idea has always been like, it takes a long time. There's no shortcuts through that process. And we just want to make sure that you're spending that time in a productive way that's also sustainable. But as I'm reading the book, I'm realizing that uh, what we're actually creating is the deliberate practice map in order to speed up the process.
For language
And so
acquisition.
for language acquisition, because if we can identify those deliberate practice loops for all of the different subskills, then we may be able to shrink that amount of time of like really focused effort that you actually need in order to accomplish the goal. So we've sort of been like looking at these, multiple thousands of hours as this unavoidable aspect of language learning. But I'm realizing now that like no one else has really mapped all of this stuff out the way we're trying to do. And if we map it out effectively and demonstrate effective practice technique in all of the areas, we may be able to shrink that time frame way down in the same way that like runners with a different way of training can achieve much better results faster. We may be able to do the same thing with language learning and shrink that multiple thousands of hours down to like 1,000 hours.
Awesome.
Yeah. So it's been an
Is it
exciting couple
called?
weeks.
What's the book exactly called? Because when I want to link it in the chat, but
It's called
is it Peak Secrets from the New Science of Expertise?
that's exactly what it is.
Cool. Okay. Because when I first Googled Peak, it came up with something that was not even a book. Then I did, yeah. Anyways,
Yeah, there's another book called Peak that's like a fiction, like a teen fiction novel. So,
I also saw one that's about like mountain climbing, and
mhm.
it was I think there's a couple different ones since it is
Yeah,
just a word.
yeah. I wanted to reach out to the researcher, and I was sad to learn that he passed away in 2020.
Oh, that's
So
too bad.
I'm gonna reach out to his co-author and get his opinion on things.
Cool. Anyways, should we get into the Q&A stream that we're here to do?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. Well, let's start with the first question from DFG here. And they ask, how can I make outputting more fun? With input, it can be quite passive, and it's easier to just hit the space bar, sit back, and keep going. Algorithms cater to our tastes with harder content, and we can just sit there quietly, accept ambiguity, and enjoy the visuals, or we can use tools that makes lookups super easy and quick. Output is more active, effortful, and focused. The gaps, while normal, can be frustrating, which makes it hard to stay engaged. When we reach for things slightly out of our level, the limits of our ability are tough to deal with. So the pull to open one's mouth and speak or to write is weaker than the pull to just click and watch a video. How can we make output as fun, engaging, dare I say addictive, and something to look forward to as doing input is? How can we reduce the friction and make the act itself a regular positive experience? TLDR, yes, when we output, there will be plenty of mistakes and challenges. That's to be expected. But how can we make output regularly enjoyable despite that?
Yeah, I would not say that we have a definitive answer on this one yet. Um, the reality is that it's pretty hard. And the obvious situation in which it becomes more enjoyable is if you're hanging out with friends. So if you make friends in the language and you spend time with them, a lot of the overthinking that goes into it, a lot of that effort kind of goes out the window because you're just engaging with language. And that's really where we want to get. And that's really a fun thing. But the process of speaking to people is a form of practice, but we would call it free flow practice. And that's akin to like a performance or, playing the game. It's not actually the practice part that helps you improve output. It helps you improve your comfort with it and your, fluidity. But there's still that other portion of I want to get better in this skill and I need to deliberately target the things that are going to help me get better at it. And that is inherently like not that fun. And we have not figured out sort of the gamification of that or the way to make those fun, enjoyable exercises. We have lots of ideas about it, but we haven't really figured it out. So what I would say is putting yourself in situations where you can make friends in the language is fun. That is a way to make output fun. And one of the things that does come from that is it gives you a reason to do the practice because you want to get better to be able to communicate more effectively with the people that you care about. And then that gives you a reason to do the more deliberate practice, the challenging practice. And it doesn't feel like as much of a grind because you have a solid reason, a solid motivation for it. So the more time that you can spend having fun outputting without the pressure, without the additional difficulty of trying to look everything up or trying to fix your mistakes, that feeds into the other area. And I would recommend prioritizing that free flow output really at the early stages of output. Just like go out and do it. Don't worry about the mistakes. Just like try and have fun. Try to form a connection in it because that's really what's going to motivate you to do all the other stuff.
Something else that I have been thinking a lot about is combining improv, like theatrical, usually comedic improv skills and techniques with output,
Sure.
because a big part of that is to sort of forget about, I guess, logic in a lot of ways and try to just like do what comes to you, go along, go with the flow, say things in a lot of kind of just saying things, and try to make it more fun that way.
Hmm.
Whether that's with writing, speaking, alone, with many people, that can depend on the person. But some of the times that I've had the most, I guess, fun outputting, like when I kind of forget about it, is when I'm doing something like that, where I'm trying just to do something a little bit creative or interesting, and I just let the writing go. I remember one time I was doing a German course many years ago at this point in Germany, and we had to like write a paragraph or write a little short story or something like that. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was on sort of a goofy prompt. And I by far was oh no, I was writing for the longest by far, to the point where at the end, I just wanted to keep writing and finish what was in my head, and everybody else in the room was like looking at me, and the teacher was like, "I'm very curious what you wrote," because everybody finished like 5 minutes ago, and I'm like, "Let me finish. I'm not done yet. Hang
Yeah.
on," because I like wanted to get this out, and so finding something like that, while probably difficult for some people who don't write or speak very much, can be very powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think in input we talk about this moment where the language sort of fades into the background and you just engage with the content or the meaning behind the language. And I think we need to reproduce that exact same process with output, where you are doing something through the language rather than doing something with the language.
Exactly. Yeah. Quick tip if anybody wants to look into it is solo RPGs can be sort of fun. They're essentially kind of complex, slightly gamified random prompt generators to help you write or say things. And they can be quite fun if you get into it and are willing to be a little creative and goofy. Cool.
And then last thing I would say is if you're really struggling to make it fun, stop worrying about your mistakes. You know, we talk a lot about, or a lot of folks in the community get really focused on the perfectionism, but perfectionism is not fun. So if your focus is fun, I would just recommend dropping all of the correction, dropping all of the worrying about doing the wrong thing or saying the wrong thing, and just put yourself in situations where you have an opportunity to let go of the language and just let it flow out.
I'd say especially at the beginning,
Yeah.
because that's when you're obviously going to have the most mistakes,
Yeah.
and the corrections will be sort of least useful as well.
Yeah. A lot of folks worry about like fossilization. Like, what if I make the same mistake over and over again? It's like, well, you're only doing this for a couple of hours. You're not going to be repeating these things thousands and thousands of times without correction. You just want to get through that initial phase of getting over the hump of that comfort level. And then you can start focusing on the correction and really refining things. So don't worry about it for like the first at least 25 hours. Just go at it and do whatever's fun.
Totally agree. Well, thank you for the question, DFG. Let's go on to the next one here. This question comes from Dave 5/4, and they ask, how does studying the language evolve from stage 3 to stage 4? Hello, I'll try to avoid my usual information dump about this question. As I'm in late stage 3 and slowly can see stage 4 on the horizon, once my speaking improves, I'm working to reprioritize and evolve how I study Spanish compared to the earlier stages, where it was more about getting the basics down, casting a wide net by sentence mining, and immersing in a lot of media. I seem to be in a place of simply filling in the holes of my grammar and vocab knowledge, and output mining seems to make more sense now that I'm focused on mastering the Spanish that I used to speak and live my daily life with overtaking in entertainment. That last part, I don't really understand. And live my daily life, period. Any advice or further ideas from the Refold team for when I go into stage 4 on my study habits?
Yeah, stage 4 is kind of a choose your own adventure. It's been a while since I wrote it, so it's not immediately accessible in my head. But if I recall correctly, there were a bunch of different directions you could take it, whether that was preparing for tests or expanding domain knowledge or focusing on like really nailing a specific domain or pursuing more advanced sub skills. Like I really want to get good at listening to X, or I really want to get good at a specific accent. So it becomes a choose your own adventure, and you have to decide what's actually important to you. The stages 0 through 3 are much more. There is a choose your own adventure portion of that, which is like choosing the things that interest you and like the content that's interesting to you. But it's still relatively rigid and straightforward. Now it's really you have to decide what's actually important to you. And I think that's the biggest distinction with stage 4, and it really requires a level of sort of like meta awareness about the process and what your goals are, and also where your deficiencies are. So I really look at you internally and take a step, before you just jump into stage 4. Take a minute and figure out like, okay, where am I at? What are my deficiencies? What do I care about fixing, and what do I care about expanding in terms of my abilities? And then from there, you should be able to inform your own stage 4 plan. What is actually important to you?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to add. That covers it all.
Yeah,
Focus on
and
the things that you want to improve at.
you may decide that nothing in stage 4 is important to you, and you just want to like go use the language in your day to day life. In which case, you can do that too. You can just bail. Like, you're done. Congratulations.
Stage 4 is a massive portion of the speaker pie. Like you can be anywhere from functionally fluent to having completed a doctorate in your target language. It's a really, really wide net, and you can pursue whatever you want.
You
Stage.
could even try to become 100% native and forget your native language.
You could do that.
Yeah,
I would not recommend it,
me neither.
but
That's not the approach I want.
yeah, why not? Cool. Thank you for the question. Go on the next one here. This question comes from Nomokezu, and they ask, how can I improve my accuracy via monologuing? I've been doing quite a bit of monologuing for Japanese, but I'm not sure on the best way to correct it. It's hard for me to catch mistakes, especially with my pronunciation, so I started manually transcribing my own monologues, which has helped me catch and correct some errors. However, I'm not sure how helpful this strategy is, as I'm often transcribing errors that I also didn't catch. Additionally, I want to be doing 30 minutes of monologuing a day, and that's too much to transcribe. Well, so once a week, I send the recording to my Japanese tutor, and we talk about that specific recording, but that's only one 5-minute recording out of all of the rest. The other days, I give my transcription to my ChatGPT tutor, but in order to do this, I need a written transcription. I would love any input and thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is never going to be 100% perfect. Um, the we will be able to get to a better space with this with technology. Like I was talking to someone yesterday who was telling me about um, a tool that just takes your italki recordings or your tutor recordings and transcribes them and identifies errors in your speech and automatically like tells you like what errors you're making in the language. I think that will probably be the direction this goes to make this easier in the future, but it's not readily available currently. I also need to figure out what that tool is because I need to connect with that founder and integrate it into our system because I think that's super useful. Um, but if you're trying to do it all manually, then you're essentially limited by your own time. So the transcription, it can help, but as you mentioned, so you're transcribing your own errors, but it does give you an opportunity to correct them. Ideally, you would send all of the recordings to a native and have them correct 100% of it, but that's very expensive and time consuming. And what you're really trying to get to a place is where you're making zero mistakes in terms of the phrasing or register or whatever sounds natural. And that's just a lifelong pursuit where you're always trying to improve more and more and more, and you can only catch, say, 5, 10 errors a day, and improve them that way. So I don't have a strong recommendation of how to do it better. It sounds like you're already doing a very good approach in terms of actually practicing and then also taking the time to try and correct your own mistakes and then also sending it off to a native speaker to get their take on things. And until we have readily available AI that can monitor everything that you're doing and identify the mistakes for you, there's really no other way to do it, I don't think.
There is a way that you can put something together that kind of does that sort of thing. If you have the recordings, you can put them through Whisper, which still isn't perfect, but something that I've noticed is that like finding Whisper's mistakes while you're listening is pretty helpful. And so what you can do is you can whisper out let's say you have a 10-minute recording, make a transcription using Whisper, then you listen to your own recording and you look at the transcription and you see where it made a mistake on what you actually said. You can fix that, and then you can shove that into another chatbot AI thing, whatever the current hotness is, which I think right now is the Claude 3 biggest one. And that can give you like some naturalness corrections and focus on things that you said a little bit weird that you didn't maybe notice, whatever it is. And so that can help you catch a lot more in a lot less time, since you have the 10 minutes to record, 15-ish minutes to correct your mistakes and transcribe, and then whatever it takes to do it, to throw it into the chatbot. So you could probably get into probably 30 minutes to get a 10-minute recording, maybe a little bit more, combining a couple of different tools. But I don't know of anything that does that all automatically, and I doubt that'll be super available and very good for at least a couple of months, but who knows at the rate that things are improving.
Yep.
But that's what I would do if I wanted to do this thing today. That's the workflow that I would do.
Yeah, I actually need to make a note of myself to connect with this person
Yeah.
and get their tool, because I do think it would be useful for the community.
Please hold while Ethan makes a note. So, anyways, thank you for the question. Nomozeku, something like that. And we'll go on to the next one here. This question comes from Sauce Soja. Does delaying output increase language anxiety? I saw an announcement talking about some people delaying output forever, or misconceptions about the Refold philosophy, like that Refold is against output in general, or whatever. Wouldn't it be better to slowly replace the delaying output to stage 3A with start speaking when it comes naturally, as the common recommendation? Like if you start with it with short and easy sentences when you feel ready, if you fully acquired those, regardless of what stage you're in, and you end up saying more overall while you still make progress, is that better? Language anxiety is definitely a thing, and the more I dig into it, fossilization seems to be a myth, right? Even from personal experience, which doesn't guarantee I'm right either, for whatever that's worth. I learned English without any method, just by using the language when needed, and each time I realized I was making a mistake for a long time, it wasn't really that hard to correct it. That's going on the fossilization part. But the main question is reducing general output anxiety.
Yeah, I think fossilization, I don't think it's a myth, but I do think it's overstated. Um, the there's also different dimensions of fossilization, which we've talked about and documented internally, but haven't released publicly yet. What kind of fossilization that you're encountering, and some of those kinds are more easy to fix than others. But in terms of language anxiety, it's absolutely a problem, but it's also a problem for beginners. It's really a problem for everyone at every stage, except for like super extroverts. And it just becomes a
It's
question
almost more
of,
like a human problem.
yeah. Yeah, humans don't like putting themselves on the spot to do things that they're bad at. Like that's just kind of a um, a natural behavior of humans.
Will you please tap dance for us right now?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would love to, but I don't have a solid floor to tap dance on. I've
Oh,
got
sure.
carpet.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, that's the
Uh-huh.
reason.
My
Um,
shoes are in the shop still. I haven't got
yeah.
them back yet.
No, performance is hard and it's very uncomfortable. And so I think that that is a problem throughout the process, regardless of how much input you've gotten. And I think there's this myth in the community that somehow if you just get enough input, you'll eventually feel ready to output. I never felt ready at any point. I just had to do it. And so I do think that there is value in doing small amounts of output through the input phase. We haven't really codified exactly what that means and how to incorporate that. Um, but there, what I will say is I will agree that there is an increase in language anxiety in the by waiting to stage 3, just because your ability to understand the language and notice your own mistakes is, it's a double-edged sword. It is useful because it helps you fix your mistakes. It is but it's also very anxiety inducing because you can notice all your own mistakes. And if you care about those mistakes, if you are over focusing on them, if you're overthinking them, it can really break your flow. Which is why in the earlier question about making output fun, I really emphasize in the early phases of output when you are dealing with this language anxiety to just stop correcting yourself. Just say whatever comes to mind and don't worry about making mistakes, just to get through that initial hump. And once you get through that and become more comfortable with it, then you can go back to focusing on the correction.
I talked about this in my 1 year update video a couple days ago, week ago, whatever it is, where when I sort of set an arbitrary point to start speaking in Czech, which is 1,000 hours. I'm not waiting to feel ready necessarily. I'm hoping I will be, but I set that basically when I started, and I think that's a pretty useful thing for a lot of people. If you say that once you hit this point, you will be speaking, can be helpful just for getting over that like initial 0 to something start, kind of like pushing yourself, but then you do have to still push yourself. And then my other plan is to completely ignore corrections and like mistakes for the first 50 hours. And unless it's like in the way of me saying like understanding, but it just to focus on getting words out there, getting the sentences, getting the sounds, and building the muscle memory for that sort of thing, and then going back into it. And so I'm planning on completely, um, I guess, going hardcore into that. Just comfort first plan.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I think prioritizing comfort with output is the most important thing to do when you first start speaking. And just the correction aspect is it's very important. Like you don't want to be speaking terribly, but it is something that can come that is more useful after you are comfortable with it.
Yeah, it's a lot easier to take a correction when you're kind of comfortable rather than your first day of speaking. They go, okay, here's your 25 errors. You go,
Yeah.
well, okay, never speaking again. That was terrible. But if you've like
Yeah,
already been
because
speaking, you're relatively comfortable and you like understand the corrections, you're like, oh yeah, sure, I can be sure to just flip the order of those or make sure to put this word in or whatever it is.
yeah, and it's funny, we look at the sort of other people in the language learning space, and they already knew this, right? It's just that they ask people to do that on day one, which we think is silly. Um, but if you've already spent 1,000 hours with the language, if you can understand native speakers, that seems like a pretty good time to start following the advice of the speak early and often folks and just like throw yourself into situations just to get through that hump. Um, I think that the over focus on perfectionism is a really detrimental to our community, and to the immersion learning community, and accepting that you will make mistakes. That is the reality of the situation. There may be the occasional person who's able to get super far and then not make huge numbers of mistakes and like actually sound pretty native from day one. I think that's extremely rare.
Yeah, that's like the 7'7" basketball player saying, just train hard. Just train hard and you'll be in the NBA. Um, yeah, going back to the speak early, speak often thing, Lamont has a really good video, Days of Words, where he talks about his experience doing Swedish speaking early and often for many years. And he's like, yeah, at the beginning you do rock it up in your what you can do and say, but then you like hit a hard ceiling that you just cannot go past. And in his experience, the only way that you can kind of break through that is mass input. And so if you kind of just switch those things around, that mass input allows you to expand your abilities essentially limitlessly and get rid of that ceiling so that when you do that early and often thing, which is more just late and often, I guess, there is no ceiling and you can just completely rock it up and your abilities just go through the roof sort of thing. And so
Yeah.
it's sort of just flipping that order makes things way more efficient and effective is the idea. We're not necessarily worried about fossilization because like we said, it's not really a one thing and it's not really a thing that happens where you just can't fix things and it's also not really a problem. So
Yeah, I mean, I think I've personally experienced fossilization. I talk to people. I was talking to someone yesterday, and he said a word incorrectly, and I was like, "Oh, you mean this?" And he's like, "I screw that up all the time. I always say this word wrong." And it's like, that's real fossilization. It happens, but it's the kind of thing that happens from thousands of encounters or thousands of mistakes built up on each other. It is not something that happens from one or two or 10 mistakes.
exactly. Great. Well, thank you for the question. Sa soja or soya. Not sure exactly how you want that said, but anyways, move on to the next question here, which is from Yuri. Here it is. And kind of similar related question. Those are synonyms. What are the limitations of immersion learning? Which aspects of language cannot be acquired through immersion within a reasonable time frame, i.e. a couple of years? In what instance is dedicated practice recommended? But I think we've just defined dedicated practice or deliberate practice a little bit differently. So what I think they're referring to is more of like deliberate study. When is that required or recommended rather?
Sure. Yeah, so I think you know, in studying for the C2 Spanish exam, I, went down a bunch of YouTube rabbit holes. And the administrators of the exam, people who have like trained to administer it and also train other people in taking it, say, I could not pass the C2 without studying for it. These are native speakers.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the fact that they have to study it in order to achieve the level that's desired by the test indicates to me that that is something that will never happen through immersion. Um, because the test is testing for something that's very specific, that is actually different than what you encounter on a day-to-day basis. And immersion can help with that. Like there's a lot of test or a lot of questions on the C2 test that are about sort of like what sounds natural in a given situation, or gives it a specific nuance, even though there's multiple correct answers. And that only comes from massive exposure to literature. Um, but the ability to do the skills that are on the test are not things that come from immersion. Um, so with that in mind, there are 100% absolutely like grammatical rules and specific literature patterns or the way that you take the test, and none of those things come from immersion. You really do need to study those.
I think you can kind of expand that to, so there's a lot of things that humans or people can only do through like deliberate teaching and exposure. A sort of really extreme example is being literate. If you're never exposed to a single, let's say, character of Chinese, and that you've been immersing in 20,000 hours of pure audio comprehensible input, you still won't be able to read. That's a thing you literally have to learn just because that is a thing that we've created. There's also a lot of things that come along with that, like good writing, clear writing, pretty much anything that you get from university or from even just basic like elementary and high school, where being able to effectively do math in your target language is a lot more different and more difficult than like it might think, because it doesn't just translate over, because there's slightly different ways things are thought about and taught that are also correct. Like there's so much out there that is not necessarily like human language acquisition related that we consider part of language. Like a
Yeah.
lot of people have the goal of being able to sound like themselves in their target language, but that will require doing similar things that you've done and practicing similar things that you've practiced in your native language. But you often don't think about that as being something that you had to specifically do since you were forced to go to school for whatever, how many years, 15 years, or whatever the school time is. Um,
Yeah,
and so
I'm
pretty
with.
much everything in there, I would say, is where you kind of have to learn deliberately.
Yeah, I remember in regards to the numbers in math, Matt had a video where like he knew all of the numbers up to a certain point, and then beyond that, when he heard a number, it was just like big number. And I'm like, yes, I've experienced that same thing. Um,
That's how I work in English, though. Honestly,
but
like if
like
somebody
I can't
says,
even repeat a number back to you in Spanish if it's too
"Oh,
big.
sure,"
Um, Whereas I can usually do that with English.
no
And I
problem.
also went down a pathway of like the ordinal numbers in Spanish, which like they
Oh,
come up in immersion, but it's not like
do
every
they?
single one of them comes up in immersion.
Oh, yeah.
So you have to learn how to count in ordinal numbers as a separate skill than just the numbers themselves.
And then you add
And
in things that are really like literal, like really rare. They're not used any time in spoken language, but everybody like gets them in school at some point. You're like, why do you know this? It's like, oh, like we learned it in fifth grade. And so
yeah,
everybody kind of knows it and is aware of it, but nobody ever says it. It's like, why does it exist? This is annoying.
yeah,
Stuff like that.
yeah. The accents in Spanish, like they're regular. They have rules,
Yeah.
and you can pick up a lot of it from immersion. But like even native speakers screw them up, and they had to study them and were tested on them in school because the rules like they exist and they're like very regular,
And they're pretty
um,
simple, actually,
and they're
but they're
pretty
still
simple rules.
hard.
Yeah, and yet like people screw them up constantly. People drop accents constantly. Like in our course server when I'm responding to Spanish speakers, like they never add accents to things.
I don't either. You don't need to. Oh, actually, just the other day, I was on a plane and it was an American airline and it was missing an accent on one of the like translations. I was like,
Hmm.
this should have an accent on it.
Yeah,
And on the Mexican airline, it does have an accent. It's the exact same
yeah,
thing. It does have an accent. It's like, come on. I
yeah.
mean,
Someone did improve
I,
it.
I know it doesn't matter, but also like you can just use a spell checker. It's free
Yeah.
nowadays.
Yeah, and then
Anyways.
like the CFR test, they like you have to use the accent, and you got to use them like according to the rules. You can mark down for that.
which is kind of crazy to me. But anyways,
So anyways, those are all examples of things that like immersion learning does not give you. It gives you like a base foundation, but you still got to practice to get them right.
mm-hmm. And again, going back to the stage 3 versus stage 4 thing, you can pick and choose. I personally don't care if I can use accents or not, and so I don't really focus on it.
Yeah.
I have a general idea of the rules, so I can kind of guess, but also I've got language tool. I don't care. I don't care about my spelling in English. But anyways, thank you for the question. Thank you for the answer, Ethan. Let's go on to another one here. My camera might burn up again because I don't doesn't have airflow or
Really
something.
got to get you a better camera.
Yeah.
I think it might be time.
Okay. We'll talk today.
Okay.
I'll bug you about it. Now, what am I doing? Next question. This question comes from Embers_OZ. And they ask, how can I remember my mature Anki cards better? Is there a way of improving your percentage of correct answers on mature cards? I've seen that you should be getting around 80% on them because you should know them, but my recall rate is a little below 75% for all time, so over 2 years of Anki. It's not uncommon for me to get way lower than that on an individual day, and I've noticed as low as 60%. Should I change my intervals? Should I do something different? And what should I do? And quick clarification, people that are watching, a mature Anki card isn't basically an Anki card that you've learned, and so it just comes back as a little refresher every so often like every couple months or potentially even years. And so these are cards that you may not have seen in 2-3 months that come up again to remind you of some rare word that you learned a long time ago, and so they're wondering how to better remember those words.
Yeah, so I guess the first question is, do you need to remember that word? Is it important? Because if you picked it up in a book somewhere and you never saw it again, and if you saw it in context, you wouldn't understand it. But if it doesn't come up often enough, then like, who cares? Like, there are so many words in English that I don't actually know, but I can just like kind of figure out through context.
An example I saw the other day was like, how many of us can define stasis well, but we all like understand it? Yeah. It's like, it's kind of hard to like really explain, but like if you come across it in context, it's pretty easy.
I don't know. I feel like you need to know that one.
Yeah.
Anyways, I'm talking about like words that came up once and you never saw again. Sure. Like, that's probably why it's hard for you to remember, because you have no additional context outside of that. So generally the way that we think about Anki is it's this priming mechanism that gives you a little piece of information that you can go fill in outside of Anki. And it just keeps things fresh until you have enough time and enough to see it other places to give you the context. But if you are not seeing it in additional context, then it's not going to reinforce an Anki. Your Anki percentages are going to be low. So your options are sort of twofold. You have to deliberately create that context, and you can either do that by go and find that word, just like type it into Google and like look for a whole bunch of examples and like read those example sentences, and or like find an article and like read the article, whatever it is. So that's like one option. The other option is that you provide additional context through your own usage of the word. So you can write sentences with the word in it in order to practice using it and create more contextual memory that way. Context that actually assists with the retention of that memory. So those are options. You could add another card for that word that goes through the relearning process again, just to like help you with a different example sentence, just to give you more context. But it's all about deliberately creating opportunities for you to encounter that word on a regular basis. But again, I would go back to the original question of, do you even need the word in the first place? And if you don't, probably just delete it. Like, I have cards all the time that come back from
pass it.
Oh, it's a year from now, and I have not seen this word.
I would say you can also just pass it. Right? I pretty much pass all my Spanish cards because all the ones that come up that I don't remember are really, really rare that I've come across once that are like from a specific dialect that I'm not learning. And so I would say that it's just, you are not there to serve Anki. Anki is there to help you learn a language. And so if it's not helping you do that, just keep going. You should not spend your time on these words that you're don't really need. And you're already getting like 73% of all the words anyway, so like that's pretty good.
Yeah.
Don't worry about trying to hit
It
exactly
only
80%
becomes
or anything.
important. Yeah, it only becomes important if you actually need to learn it for a specific reason.
Sure.
Um, like if you are studying for a test and you need 100%, then it makes sense to like really put in the effort to reinforce that. But if it's just to improve your immersion, you haven't seen that word anywhere else, then you're not actually improving your immersion by retaining it.
Agreed. Cool. Thank you for the question. Next question here comes from DomiBot, and they ask, if I don't care about reading, should I bother doing it? And they say, if I honestly don't care about being able to read in my target language, at least past the point of at which the lack of reading ability wouldn't hinder me too much outside of being able to read books and such, is it worthwhile reading at all in order to better other aspects of my language learning? So to focus on other things instead of reading. Or would my time be spent hardly ever reading? Or would my time be better spent hardly ever reading, instead opting for spending more time listening and speaking? Um, they're just not compelled to read. And so if it wasn't to help much of my language learning, I wouldn't feel like I'm missing out on anything.
Sure. Um, I mean, people learn languages for a long time before there was reading, before reading existed. So reading is a relatively new invention. Writing is a relatively new invention in human history. Um, so it is 100% possible to go purely down the listening route and just acquire the language that way. I will say there's a lot more words now than there were back then, in terms of like what you encounter on a regular basis. So the it takes longer to do the listening approach. Um, I would say having a base level of reading ability is a useful thing to have in the language. It's kind of part of the process in modern day world. You know, you want to be able to read street signs and manuals and restaurant um,
Menus.
menus. Yeah. In terms of the actual benefits from a language learning standpoint, uh, reading is it is much easier to reinforce your vocabulary and your grammar knowledge from reading than it is to do it from listening. Just because there are so many things that you miss with listening when you're in the learning phase that you just will not hear. Um, and when you look at grammar in a reading format, it's explicit. It tells you exactly like what is on the page. There's no ambiguity about what you're hearing. So that added level of interpretation from a listening standpoint adds to the complication of reinforcing words that you know or reinforcing grammar patterns that you've seen before or learning new grammar patterns or new words. So not impossible, but just adds a layer of difficulty. Um, I think that if you hate reading, if it genuinely is not interesting to you, then don't do it because what we're trying to optimize for is you sticking with it long term. And if reading is going to be like a terrible experience for you that's going to make you hate the whole process, then it's not worth doing. Um, but
I
yeah, I'd
would
still do some
recommend,
reading.
yeah, like I would recommend also sort of checking in with what you mean by being able to read, because it's not necessarily clear here if it, because like they do mention sort of if it hinders your ability outside of being able to read books and such. And if you're thinking of reading books as reading, then you can kind of lose some of the picture where of all of the other times that we essentially need and use reading and text all the time, whether it's from texting, reading web pages, navigation. There's so many ways that reading is almost required for living in 2024, where if you have trouble reading or trouble writing, there's a lot more difficulty in things and it's a lot more complicated to do certain things. If you have no interest in being able to do those, or like the language that you're learning doesn't have a written version, there's different arguments to be made. But I just check in with what you want to be able to do with the language, and if there's things that aren't strictly 100% audio based, you probably want to be able to read relatively fluently and functionally, but you don't necessarily have to have the vocab that allows you to read a complicated novel. That's something that's totally separate from being able to read at all. And so finding that level, I think, is important. And then, like Ethan said, some amount of reading is very helpful for getting the basics of the language, especially, and helping you to latch onto something early on in the process so that you don't have to just pure listen to comprehensible input, which might not even be available for your language, whatever you're learning. And so I think there's a lot more to this question that you should think about before necessarily deciding to never read. That's something else I wanted to say, but I forgot it.
Too bad, it's gone
Reading.
now.
Yep, it's gone. Oh, well. Oh, the other thing was that just from my experience, like interacting with people in the community, there's a lot of people that complain about not being able to hear and understand the small words, little words in languages, pretty much any language. And almost always, they hardly do any reading. And like it does at a certain point get kind of frustrating and difficult to improve more on those little nuanced things like word order or small words, prepositions, whatever they might be, if you don't do reading. Because, like Ethan said, you can just glaze over them, glance over them, whatever the phrase is. You can ignore them because you're understanding the main idea, the gist. But those little things can be very, very helpful for improving and becoming more natural and fluent, especially when you go to output. Because if you realize that you've never actually properly heard the difference between and of in English, which is frequently pronounced the same, you will sound sort of odd when you output because you have this lack of understanding of a concept unless you've done thousands and thousands of hours of input, which is it's very difficult to get that amount of comprehensible input, whatever. And so I would also caution against doing just no reading because you will probably find your skills lacking at a certain point.
There's also a problem of native speakers dropping the small things,
Yep.
rather than like, and then, they'll be speaking quickly, they'll drop something, and then if you ask them to repeat it slowly, they would include it.
Mm-hmm.
But because they're speaking quickly, they just drop things that seem unnecessary, or that they've just like their brain has decided or is not worth saying. And so if you're learning from people who do that and speak that way, then you're not going to be able to, when you slow down, you're still going to be doing it wrong, even though they can do it correctly if they slow down.
Yeah, sort of good example is like all the contractions that we use in English that if you don't use them sound weird, but if you use them wrong, they also sound really weird, but they're really hard to hear, especially when we contract like had and would the exact same, even though those are completely different words. It can be pretty annoying to learn sort of the differences in those things and be able to naturally understand what they had said exactly rather than what they meant, which can be very useful. Even though meaning is king, you kind of want to know what they said as well. Cool. Thank you for the question. I think we have time for maybe one or two more here. So let's do this one quickly, and then we'll go to the chat to see what they have to say. This question comes from Semach, and they ask, when would paid one-on-one professional intensive instruction be worth it? If someone had the money to spend on an 8-week course for an intensive one-on-one speaking instruction course in the target language country, maybe 4 to 6 hours per day with a speaking coach, what would be the Refold recommendation on when to do it? What stage in the process and would help you get the most out of that? I'm assuming stage 3, but if you have any elaboration about this, please let me know. An example they give is like Keats School for Mandarin Learning in Kunming.
So I think
other schools like that.
Yeah, so we've talked a couple times now about that this initial output transition, how to make it easier, how to make it more fun. I think a program like this is perfect for that because it kind of sucks when you first get started, and if you are just looking for an opportunity to really immerse yourself in something that requires you to speak consistently in order to build up that comfort level, that's a perfect time to do it. The other time that it would be really valuable is after you've gotten comfortable with it and you're trying to really nail in on the perfectionist aspects and you need somebody to correct you. Having a teacher there to notice and correct your mistakes consistently can help you really hone in on the those more perfectionist aspects of the language. So I'd say those are sort of the two times that I would do it, either right at the beginning of stage 3 when you're doing the output transition, or later on in stage 3 or stage 4 when you're trying to perfect your language ability.
Cool. I totally agree. I have nothing else to add. No opinions.
Hooray.
Yay. Thank you for the question. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat here that we can blitz through, sort of
Let's do it. Rapid fire.
first ones. First question is, when can we expect to see all of the Refold crowdsourced docs up? Is it a matter of weeks or months? And they were probably referring to the new spreadsheet crowdsourced docs that I made a video about recently that are really awesome. Those we're not making one for every single language unless we have somebody who is actively learning that language, who is a active member of the community, who is willing to be a curator for that doc. We've decided that like trying to just make one for all of the languages isn't really going to work unless there's somebody actively caring for it and working on it. And I found that like that's why the Czech one is, well, I would say really, really good, is because I look at it basically every day in some way. I'm always thinking about new resources. I'm always thinking about how to make it better. And that's really, really valuable for that sort of thing. And the old Google Docs sort of withered a little bit because there was no active learner who cared about that language maintaining them. And so that's why we have the list that we do right now there, because we found somebody who's wants to do that language. Since making that video, we've had a couple of more people reach out to us for some languages, some bigger languages like Japanese, but then we also have ones for languages like Hindi, very widely spoken, but not as learned, which is cool. Somebody for Scottish Gaelic. And so we'll hopefully get those out in a few weeks, but we just need people to do them. And so to
Got one for Klingon, so
yeah, we have one for Klingon, we have one for Basque, Hawaiian, Quechua. Like they can be done for any language as long as you care about that language and learners of that language.
Yeah, we need a steward of. You can sort of think this as a garden. We're like constantly planting new seeds in the garden. We need somebody to like actually manage the garden.
Exactly.
And internally, like we can play that role for some languages, but it's so much better if somebody is in the middle of learning and has gone through the process and understand what's good and what's not. They can just provide a much better perspective than we can.
Exactly. And it's not even that big of a process. The initial like bulk dump of resources to make it just not look like an empty garden is maybe a couple hours of work. But after that, I think I spend 15 minutes maybe per week on the Czech doc, maybe. And I think it's honestly less than that. And mostly it's just like finding new resources in my immersion and adding it to the list. So
yeah, so if you're interested, definitely reach out to Ben at refold.la or on my cheese on the Discord servers.
George Pig works too.
Clayton. Yeah, Clayton either. Or Clayton too. And if you're interested in, being a steward of one of these docs, like absolutely come on board. We'll get one set up for you. We'll help you with the initial dump and organization. And then it's just like a pretty loose amount of management after that.
Good question. Thank you. I saw another pretty quick one. Oh, William Lopez asks, how do you achieve a good level of fluency in a language? I would definitely recommend you check out the Refold website. We have a very good guide on doing exactly that. It is check out the simplified guide, which I believe is refold.la/guide/simplified/simplified.
Yeah.
Another question.
There's also an overview if you just want like a quick one pager. I think it's /overview, and that's linked from the homepage.
The homepage, yeah. A Death Note asks, I'm in 2C. What can I do to improve as quickly as possible?
Narrow your focus.
Hours and focus is what I would say.
Yeah, I would say hours of the hard stuff. So when we think about, the more intensive versus the free flow, really dedicating the time and effort on a daily basis. Not all hours are created equal. Not all activities are created equal. If you want to improve quickly, then doing the things that feel like they are working your brain is more valuable, and then also narrowing what you are trying to accomplish. So that's the narrowing of the domain, really narrowing in on like a specific topic or a specific set of videos, one specific TV show, narrowing your focus, and then actually doing the hard work. That'll get you there much faster.
Great. Well, that is our time. We're at 11 o'clock, or 10 o'clock rather, 10 Pacific. Anything else you'd like to add? Yeah, they're
No, just thanks everybody for attending and for watching live or watching the recording. We got a lot of cool stuff in the works on the back end. We're really kicking up into high gear. Um, we're also hiring, so we're hiring a marketing person that'll go out in the newsletter on Monday. But if you're interested, you can email me directly, ethan@refold.la. And we're going to be hiring a couple more people going over the course of the next few months as we build up our team.
awesome. Well, thank you so much for being here, Ethan. Have a fantastic rest of your day. Goodbye to everybody else on the interwebs. Thank you for your questions. If we didn't get to your question, make sure to put it in the Discord for next time, and we'll answer it in. I think we're doing another one in May, actually, because this is the April live stream.